Good evening and welcome to the NDTV Dialogues, a conversation of ideas. This week, what's making big headlines is the economy, and joining me tonight is Dr Arvind Panagariya, the former head of the NITI Aayog and currently at Columbia University. Dr. Panagariya, it's interesting now when you're coming in as a perspective from an outsider in a sense, and today has been a very newsy day in terms of reform. We've seen a slew of FDI decisions announced by the cabinet. You've had a very optimistic World Bank forecast about India as the fastest growing GDP country in the world. What's your take on these?
Well, both I think are good pieces of good news. I think FDI liberalization. There had been a lot of talk about taking this to 100% automatic route for single brand. Has happened. I'm very glad. Air India also, I think, you know, they for 9%. Good move. Good signal to the markets. And the World Bank report, I totally endorse whatever they said. Actually, but I mean, I've only seen the newspaper reports, so I haven't actually read the report. But from the newspaper reports, I practically agree with whatever they have said, including the forecast. I think 7.3% for the calendar year 2018 is just about right. You know, I mean, you know, maybe it could be a little higher, but it's not anybody's guess. But 7.3 seems to me to be quite good because not. For the longer term, it's a little tepid. They are talking like 7%. I think we'll do better in the longer term because a lot of the reforms that have been done in the last 3 years, 3.5 years, the impact of those reforms is yet to be felt. You know, I mean, maybe some bit of effect has happened, but the big effect that is to come is still has still not come. And we know from the past experience that this always takes a little while.
To kick in.
Yeah, the impact of the reform, because you know, if you go back, Prime Minister Narasimha Rao had done a lot of reforms, then Prime Minister Vajpayee did a lot of the reforms. So
Prime Minister Vajpayee benefited from the Narasimha Rao reforms, and you're saying UPA one benefited in a sense from the Vajpayee reforms.
Yeah, to some degree, but really the big impact finally happened starting from 2003-04 when we got launched into an 8% growth trajectory. And for nearly a decade, we grew at 8%. So that was the impact of the reforms that happened, you know, during those two prime ministers' tenures.
And well, let's see how, because of course, the UPA government will argue that some of the growth that they achieved in their years, it has actually been diminished by the Modi years. And in fact, that's the government, and of course, you have always been much more optimistic on what the Indian economy is currently looking like. But if you've seen in the recent Gujarat elections as well, in the recent opposition today as well on FDI, they've pointed out certain contradictions. For one, they point out even on FDI that the BJP's initial stand on FDI, though it was on multi-brand retail, was completely different, with Prime Minister Modi famously saying the Congress is selling the country to foreigners. And of course, this argument as well on how rosy our economy is looking. They point at negative growth in the agriculture and manufacturing sector, which of course is a job growth engine. So which way do we actually read these figures?
Well, look, you know, again, I mean, in terms of
glass half empty or half full.
Well, that's true, but to some degree, the present government got set up because UPA in its second term really did a lot of things which were anti-growth, and we were talking about the lags. And there also it was some lag, you know. So finally, although a lot of the bad things had started happening from 2009, but 12-13 and 13-14 is when the growth really dipped in a big way. And then the Modi government had to really bring this back up. So which took a lot of effort, and finally in the first 3 years, the economy did manage to grow 7.5%. But then of course we had the effects of demonetization, the GST, due to which at least in certain quarters we went down to 5.7. Now we are back to 6.3. But I think now we are really on the upward trend, and I think things should be getting better. And in 2 years' time, I would certainly expect us to be in 8% range.
What are the things that you are most optimistic about in the next 2 years, and what are the things that you think are causes of worry? I mentioned agriculture and manufacturing. What do you feel are the worries?
No, agriculture, of course, is a very difficult sector. It continues to still remain dependent on the weather. Drought happens, the crops fail, and so forth. So, agriculture is a difficult one, and you know, to some degree, we have been able to shield the GDP from getting impacted in a big way by it, simply because now the share of agriculture is 15% or less. but the amount of workforce that is employed in agriculture is so large that we have not been able to shield our people from the negative impacts that happen in agriculture. So that remains a problem, I think, because so many people are dependent on agriculture. So there, I think, we have to continue to build up the social safety nets in a stronger way. I mean, the present government did do the crop insurance and so forth, but I think still work to be done there. Manufacturing, I personally think, is very, very important. No country that I know of which has succeeded in transforming itself, say over a period of about 3 decades or so, has done it without manufacturing really doing very well. And we are still kind of not quite there in terms of manufacturing. We still need, and that's of course where the link to the jobs also comes. Because of a variety of factors, the informal sector dominates in terms of employment. So it gives a lot of employment, but it's very low productivity employment. But on the other hand, the output comes in the formal sector, but not enough employment there.
So let me just ask you, that's a really interesting point you made, that you may have insulated GDP a bit from the negative impact of agriculture growth going down, but the number of people it impacts. And I think perhaps it's played out in the Gujarat elections and recent elections, where that's really a point the opposition is hammering home. And the Gujarat model, which you've talked about famously in your work with Professor Jagdish Bhagwati as well, the Gujarat model was touted as fake, looking at the unrest amongst farmers of Gujarat, where in fact the opposition did much better in rural areas, and also looking at young people in Gujarat coming out in, say, the Hardik Patel or the Jignesh Mevani, talking about the lack of jobs. So two economic phenomena translating very much into political unrest for a ruling party.
Well, first the Gujarat model. I don't think that Gujarat model has failed, because as I have tried to clarify time and again, for me Gujarat model is a metaphor for sort of growth-driven, market-driven kind of economic prosperity, and so that this term we used actually in contrast to the Kerala model, and I sometimes said that the success of Kerala itself is due to Gujarat model, because they managed to get good growth. If you think in terms of the and Kerala model, I said is a more redistributive kind of model, but on redistribution, Kerala really didn't do well at all, because it's one of the most unequally distributed states in India. So that's that. Now coming to Gujarat, now I think I'm not a political analyst, but 22 years of incumbency or anti-incumbency, whichever you want to look at it, that's tough for any government. And in this case, the Prime Minister really was in Delhi. He was not in Gujarat for the last 3.5 years. And so, there are many factors at work. Because I think we act very simplistic or talk very simplistically. I mean, after all, UP election had also happened very recently. Same distress probably existed even more, and the dependence on agriculture in UP is a lot more than in Gujarat. And yet in UP, the BJP did extremely well, superbly well. So I think I would attribute the results largely to the reduced majority of the BJP in Gujarat to a bit of anti-incumbency. I think fatigue sets in, and so it's difficult for anybody to sustain for that long.
Sure, but it's interesting you brought up UP as well, because I think the issues being raised in each state have been quite different. And in UP, of course, we saw a strong perhaps Hindutva element as well coming up. We're seeing it in Karnataka, and even in Gujarat. The argument some political observers would make is that while right now it's opposition talking about jobs, perhaps in contrast to Prime Minister Modi's 2014 campaign, where Vikas was very much the center focus of his election promises, that now that seems to have changed, and we are back to focusing on Hindutva and cows in 21st century elections. What's happened to all the issues of jobs, of economy, areas which are your area of expertise in a sense?
Yeah, but I mean, I don't think the leadership is focusing on Hindutva or cow and all, but every party.
No, chief ministers are. We just had Yogi in Karnataka talking about who's a true Hindu.
But in the end, look, you know, I mean, after the initial upsurge in this kind of activity in UP also, things have calmed down completely, and what Yogi is pushing, what Chief Minister Yogi is pushing is not the Hindutva or cow agenda, but much broader kind of economic progress issues. And he's having this investment summit very soon.
In the United States, yes.
So you know, I think that in the end, the Chief Minister, as the politicians realize that well, first I think, you know, their heart may be in the right place, and so therefore they want to develop the state, but also they realize that politically in the end, unless they deliver to the people prosperity, they are not going to be returned, and I think that's a very powerful incentive.
That's an interesting point, because I mean, when we talk about so many models, and of course Mr. Vajpayee's India Shining model and the shock that came, people would say perhaps because of rural India at that time, the same with the UPA, which once did better in the cities, and then of course lost both in the cities and rural issues as well. Do you think that sometimes, and they always say that, oh, people sitting in air-conditioned studios, we can turn off the AC, that makes it better, but they always say that people with AC studios, economists are out of touch with the ground realities of India. So we keep pointing to GDP figures, but that ignores what's actually happening on the ground. In fact, even the new NITI Aayog chief made the point that foreign educated economists don't know enough about India, they don't spend time in its villages.
You know, this I get this a lot. I get this a lot, that, you know, how can you be working on poverty if you're not poor? You know, experiencing poverty might help you, but to understand poverty, it is not necessary that you have to have been poor. People ask me, you know, oh, have you been to villages? So I ask back, how many villages have you visited? So usually they say, oh, maybe I visited 100 or 150 villages. So my answer is, India has 600,000 villages. From 150 villages, how do you find out what is happening in the rest of the 600,000 villages? So nobody can visit the 600,000 villages that we have. And this is why we systematically have the sample surveys, surveys that are properly drawn out, they are representative, and you take your sample from every state, and within the state you take it from every district, and so forth. So if you are properly doing your sample surveys, you will pick up that. So we should do both, and my father came from a village, so I visit occasionally my ancestral village. I see what is going on there. So we all pick up some element of what is going on in rural India, but at the end of the day, I don't think there is a substitute for systematic study, because, you know, no matter how many villages you have visited, it's going to be a very tiny fraction of the total number of villages in India.
So is the view from Columbia University now very different from when it was when you were in the corridors of NITI Aayog, in the sense that there is much more optimism internationally? It often seems when you read the international press about India than when it is when you open the newspapers or watch television debates back in India and listen to what's happening. And two, what would you want to see as your dream budget? You're now a private advisor, not an official advisor. What would you see as your dream budget coming up on the 1st of February?
Well, you know, one knows that the very last budget of the last full budget of a government can't be your dream budget. So one has to temper one's expectations there. But on the whole, I think, you know, in this particular budget, given where we are, I would say that one thing I hope is that we do not give away the path of fiscal rectitude. This government really has been very steady and very consistent in terms of bringing our fiscal deficit, and it really has, you know, as you said, sitting outside, one thing I see is that internationally this has really got us a lot of brownie points, you know, that the government is being very responsible. So whereas
we're inching closer to that deficit figure.
Sorry?
We're inching much closer to that deficit figure.
We are, yeah. So there is pressure right now. We know that, but there also. So I mean, there are some voices here which are saying that, look, you know, oh, what's the big deal about it? You can just let it go by 0.5% or 0.7, 0.8%. Personally, I would say, you know, I mean, if 3.2 turns into 3.3 or 3.4, that will be okay. I think, you know, markets will understand that, and they would see that a big GST reform had been done, and therefore, you know, if the revenues really didn't pan out as one had hoped, some bit of slippage would be tolerated, you know. But if we let it go out of hand, you know, purposely, and go on and spending spree, I think that the markets are not going to be forgiving. And we anyway, purely in terms of our own rectitude, I would say, let's not do that. And so for the next budget, I would say, I would still like to stick to at least about 3.2%. So we may not reduce it further down to 3%, but I think we should still aim for containing it at 3.2%, and then we can return after the elections, return back to getting to 3% or what have you, whatever the long-term goal is. So I would. That's one thing I would very much like to see in the budget.
And jobs, jobs, jobs. I mean, that really seems to be, especially with India's growing youth population, that really seems to be the big political hot potato in a sense. And has the government perhaps dropped the ball here? Because the government's own figures, which admittedly don't even take in the informal sector, seem to show that that's stagnated or in fact often deflated in a sense. And the jobless growth now seems to be a reality. Is that your big worry?
So, look, I mean, one has got to make a distinction here that when we say jobless growth, I don't believe that there is jobless growth. You can't grow 7.5% and not have jobs growing. I mean, you got either productivity rises and you grow because of productivity increases, or your inputs that you are using, they grow faster and you grow faster. Those are the only two ways. I mean, it's a purely accounting point that growth consists of either productivity growth or growth in the inputs that you are using given the current technology. We know actually from the research that has been done for decades now that productivity growth can give you 3% max, not even 4%. I have not heard any country doing it. So obviously the inputs have grown. But the problem we have for jobs is really good jobs, jobs that pay a decent wage. That is what has been lacking, and that of course is coming from the fact that we have this underemployment, meaning that these are very low productivity jobs, therefore they pay low wages. Tasks that can be done by one person are being done by three. I mean, I'm sure you see it in your everyday life. Yes. If there is a plumbing problem, 3 people will come in, one will do the job, the other 2 will be watching the third person who is doing the job. So there is underemployment. People are doing something but not fully productively, and that is what we need to do. And this is where you see the whole slew of structural reforms that need to be done in labor markets, in land markets. That is what we have to return to. I suspect we are not going to return to them so early, meaning in the current budget it's the last one, but in the next term the government has to return to those.
No, also because these are often very politically controversial decisions when you talk about labor reform, etc. Do you find that in that sense now, with now the road to 2019 literally ahead for this government, that there may be a return to populism, though of course the Prime Minister is sending out the right signals with the continuing reform, but there will be a return to populism when it comes to winning elections, when it comes to winning 2019, and often a government hits a bump when it loses an election, just when it was really hitting its stride in its reform path. For tough reforms, the good thing is this government has a majority and it's going to have a Rajya Sabha majority as soon too, but they don't have that much time left.
Right. So I said, I mean, I'm not expecting that the government will do the tough labor law reforms in the coming year, but at least the reforms that are not as tough, those we should do. But then there should be a resolve to once after 2009 the elections happen, the government comes in. I think then we have to start I mean, that will be the time to actually get back to the labor law reforms in a big way, in a very serious way. Because if we are going to ever solve this problem, I mean, in the end, look, unless the firms have a certain size and they are in the formal sector, you are not going to capture the global markets. When you are thinking of own account enterprises and enterprises that are with 5 workers, 8 workers, they are not your exporting firms. You at least have to have a few hundred workers, particularly in the labor intensive sectors. So you need the size, and that can't happen unless you've got flexibility in the labor markets. So we'll need to do that if that's our goal. I mean, think of I use apparel as my favorite example. $465 billion worth market. We have only 18 billion. China is doing, these are 2015 figures, China did 175 billion, but it's declining. It is down to about 158 billion now in 2016.
So this is our opportunity.
And this is our big opportunity. So, we got to ensure, a lot of the times when we think of labor reforms, we start thinking purely in terms of, protecting the existing workers who have these good jobs. But of course, there has to be a balance, that the incentives have to be there for the entrepreneurs to also hire new workers who are formal sector employees.
But you talk about entrepreneurs. We just had recently a prominent businessman talk about the fact that it's still as difficult to do business in India, that it's still easier to set up a startup in Singapore, that all this hype about make in India, startup in India, stand up India, all then eventually ends up in hype. Where's the actual change happening on the ground?
Yeah. Well, we have made progress. So I'm not a pessimist. When you start at such a low level, right? We ranked 142. In fact, when this government came in, but if you go back, we ranked perhaps even worse. And so we are now, this is the doing business ranking, ease of doing business. So we are top 100. So we have made good progress. But if you're then going to compare it to Singapore, of course, we are still very far away, very far away from Singapore. So it's still, the goal remains. I mean, it is, but and this is why actually we have to keep working at these things. We shouldn't get discouraged, because we are making progress.
No, or complacent. And also the point, Dr. Panagariya, I remember asking you in an earlier interview that if you had to teach demonetization at Columbia University, how would you actually look at it, as a success or a failure? Asking you again now that you're back here, we've had enough time perhaps of to get some perspective, and also with the introduction of GST and the kind of double whammy the economy went through. Do you think demonetization today, could you say, is an ill-conceived decision? You're not in government anymore, so you can be frank.
No. I mean, I think I probably answered you while
diplomatically, but it is a bad Skype line, so now I've got you across the table.
Yeah, okay. So no, I haven't changed my mind. So, of course, when we teach it in the classroom, we would present both sides, and obviously we have to look at what the other scholars have said. Then I can give the students my view, and I haven't changed my mind. I think, if the objective is to combat corruption, I mean, you can question that, should we be combating corruption, right? Is this a good time to be doing this, rather than say that, all right, I'll take, whatever corruption is happening, I'm not going to really touch on that yet. Let me first grow in a big way, and then I'll go back, worry about cleaning up. So that we can argue about. But once you have made the decision that, look, we got to combat corruption, then I don't think you can really say that, well, no, but I'll keep the business as usual as far as the use of cash in all these other activities is concerned.
No, but that's like the operation is successful or the patient is dead. I mean, that's
slightly
an unfair way to present it. Nobody will say you don't want to fight corruption, but were there other ways to do it? No,
but what other ways? I mean, the other ways are also being used. This was only one of the many steps. So demonetization was not the single step by the Prime Minister. I mean, it was preceded by at least 6 or 7 other measures, and has also been followed by other things that have been going on. And this is certainly, Prime Minister, if wants to give a strong signal that, look, this is not a government of business as usual type. So don't take, when the people are not taking him seriously, he says, look, here I'm serious about this. And at least the people have supported it. So I mean, in the drawing rooms, in the air conditioning and so forth, people are all complaining about the long queues and so forth. But the common man is standing happily in the queues and saying that, well, I'm not the only one. Not, everybody is standing in the queue.
Did lots of students actually ask about it? Did you have lots of students asking you about this case study of demonetization?
Well, this is one of the first things people obviously ask, because that's a big thing they see India did. So. Yes, of course.
So, Dr. Panagariya, an optimist as ever, and your predictions for growth are higher than the World Bank as well. Do you think? And
at least the longer term. I mean, yes. I agree with theirs on the short one, the 2018 one. I agree, but I think on that longer one, they are a little conservative for me.
And you've of course always said that growth is the only cure for poverty.
Well,
so let's
in the end, a lot of the other things you can do, if you got growth, then you got the money to spend on anti-poverty programs. This is how we could do Narega, because we were growing in those days at 8% or so.
You were a critic of Narega, but it's still very much around.
Oh, no, I'm still, I think, if I had my other alternatives, then I would do it differently. I mean, I still think that I'll rather do the cash transfers. But one time I think you had asked me whether, what about Narega? And my take always has been that, look, if it's Narega and nothing else, then of course I'll take Narega, because you got to have that kind of social program. But if I have my choice of the social program, how I spend the money, then I won't do it the Narega way.
You've been watching Dr. Panagariya, also the whole debate over Aadhaar, because I mean, there's a whole controversy now about, okay, cash transfers in a sense. Aadhaar is one way where you can, some of them like kerosene or where like LPG, you can actually get the cash directly into your bank account. But this whole worry about Aadhaar being used as a kind of tool which actually is depriving people of their benefits. How worried are you about possible security breaches, etc.?
That's something we need to go and fix the problem. I mean, I'm not, so where actually your biometric prints are simply not coming through, right, and or verification is not happening, we got to find the alternative ways to get the ration of the people to their homes and so forth. So access cannot be denied because the biometrics is failing. So I think, I'm completely with that. But by and large, let's not make the best the enemy of good. I think by and large, I think Aadhaar has been an incredibly good innovation, and we have very successfully done it. If there are 5% of the people where there is a problem, find an alternative solution. But where biometrics works, I think we've got to use it because it certainly is such an effective tool in the end of cutting so many ghost cards and ghost accounts and so forth. So
no, I agree with you. I think the benefits of Aadhaar in that sense are huge. And just a final question, Dr. Panagariya, with your professorial hat, in a sense, that when it comes to India having an economist prime minister and a political prime minister, who's better for the economy?
I would say,
no political inclinations.
No. I think in the end, no prime minister can be a non-political prime minister. So even if it's an economist who is the prime minister, he'll have to be political. I mean, at a lower level, I was in the government, and you can't be completely apolitical. You cannot be, and you should not be. I think, I mean, in this sense, I'd always taken the view that you cannot be a public servant and public intellectual at the same time. Public intellectual would question everything in public. If you are inside the government, I don't think that's the right way to be inside the government. You can have differences inside, but I don't go for differences, expressing those differences outside and being critical of the government and all. So likewise, so on the prime minister, even if let's say Dr. Manmohan Singh was an economist, he had to have a political hat, and you can see that coming through even now. I mean, he is not a prime minister, but I think many of the statements that we have heard him make remain political, and so he's much more of I think after all he's a very senior figure in the Congress party, and so he cannot be apolitical.
Right. Dr. Panagariya, thank you very much for being here. Fascinating to listen to your forecast for the Indian economy, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Great pleasure, as always.
Thank you.